I create dark, extreme horror stories, and for just $1, you can help me keep the horror alive. It's like buying me a terrifying cup of coffee to fuel the next gruesome tale. If you'd like to support, please consider donating. My PayPal link is in the description. Due to YouTube guidelines, it's difficult to create R-rated content, so I kindly request you to join me on Patreon for just $1. The old house stood at the end of a narrow, overgrown lane, shrouded by tall trees that blocked most of the light. Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled into the driveway. He hadn't set foot here in nearly 10 years, not since he'd left for college. Now, his mother was dead, and he had returned to settle her affairs. Mark had never liked the house. It was old, creaking, and smelled of dampness even on the best of days. But when he was a child, his mother's presence had made it feel safe, despite the darkness that always seemed to lurk in the corners of each room. But now, it was different. Now, it felt like a tomb. He got out of the car and looked up at the windows, expecting to feel some pang of nostalgia. Instead, a chill crept up his spine. The house felt wrong. Something about the way the shadows pooled around the windows, thick and unmoving, made him uneasy. Shaking off the feeling, Mark walked up to the front door, the keys jingling in his hand. As he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of the house washed over him, dust, wood, and a faint mustiness that hadn't changed. He stood in the foyer for a moment, listening. It was too quiet. No birds outside, no creak of the old pipes. The stillness pressed in on him. He headed straight for his mother's bedroom, wanting to get the worst of it over with. The coroner had said she died peacefully in her sleep. But Mark wasn't sure if he believed that. His mother had always been healthy, vibrant even. Something about her sudden death had felt off. The room was neat, just as she had always kept it. The bed was made, the dresser free of clutter. He felt a pang in his chest as he noticed the framed photo on the nightstand. It was one of the two of them from when he was a child, his mother smiling, her arms wrapped around him, but as he stepped closer, a cold breeze brushed his face, and the bedroom door creaked behind him. He turned, heart pounding, stood at the end of a narrow, overgrown lane, shrouded by tall trees that blocked most of the light. Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled into the driveway. He hadn't set foot here in nearly 10 years, not since he'd left for college. Now, his mother was dead, and he had returned to settle her affairs. Mark had never liked the house. It was old, creaking, and smelled of dampness even on the best of days. But when he was a child, his mother's presence had made it feel safe, despite the darkness that always seemed to lurk in the corners of each room. But now, it was different. Now, it felt like a tomb. He got out of the car and looked up at the windows, expecting to feel some pang of nostalgia. Instead, a chill crept up his spine. The house felt wrong. Something about the way the shadows pooled around the windows, thick and unmoving, made him uneasy. Shaking off the feeling, Mark walked up to the front door, the keys jingling in his hand. As he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of the house washed over him, dust, wood, and a faint mustiness that hadn't changed. He stood in the foyer for a moment, listening. It was too quiet. No birds outside, no creak of the old pipes. The stillness pressed in on him. He headed straight for his mother's bedroom, wanting to get the worst of it over with. The coroner had said she died peacefully in her sleep. But Mark wasn't sure if he believed that. His mother had always been healthy, vibrant even. Something about her sudden death had felt off. The room was neat, just as she had always kept it. The bed was made, the dresser free of clutter. He felt a pang in his chest as he noticed the framed photo on the nightstand. It was one of the two of them from when he was a child, his mother smiling, her arms wrapped around him, but as he stepped closer, a cold breeze brushed his face, and the bedroom door creaked behind him. He turned, heart pounding, but slowly swinging shut. Swallowing hard, Mark left the room and shut the door behind him. The hallway was dim, and as he passed the living room, a strange feeling swept over him. He hesitated, glancing toward the shadows pooling under the curtains. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw something moving in the corner of his eye, but when he turned to look, there was nothing but the empty space. That night, Mark sat on the couch, a glass of whiskey in hand, trying to calm his nerves. The funeral had been simple, just him and a few neighbors, no extended family. As he sipped his drink, his mind wandered back to his childhood. His mother had been strict but loving, always watching out for him. But there was something about her that had always made him uneasy. She had her secrets, locked away in those late-night whispers he sometimes overheard when he was supposed to be asleep. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise. A soft creak, like footsteps. He put the glass down and listened. The house had always made sounds, but this was different, deliberate, as if someone were walking down the hall. He stood up slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound continued, coming closer. The hallway was empty, but as he approached, he noticed a strange chill in the air. His breath fogged in front of him as he neared the source of the noise. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from his mother's room. As if something heavy had fallen. Mark froze, staring at the closed door. He didn't want to go in there, but something pulled him, something that felt like it wasn't his own will. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling. As the door creaked open, the room appeared undisturbed, the bed still made, the photo still on the nightstand. But then, he saw it, a shadow standing near the foot of the bed. It was faint, barely visible, in his throat as the figure turned slowly. His mother's face stared back at him, pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with something that was no longer human. Before he could move, she was gone, disappearing as quickly as she had appeared. His heart raced. He stumbled back out of the room, slamming the door shut. He knew what he had seen. It was her, but it wasn't her. Something had taken her place. Over the next few days, the house grew colder, and the strange occurrences became more frequent. Doors slammed on their own, objects moved inexplicably, and the whispers grew louder at night, almost like voices calling to him from the dark. Mark couldn't sleep. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next sound, the next chill to creep into his bones. The shadowy figure of his mother appeared more frequently, always watching him from the corners of the room, her eyes filled with a strange hunger. Desperate for answers, Mark began digging through his mother's things. In the attic, hidden beneath a pile of old blankets, he found a leather-bound journal. It was filled with strange symbols, drawings, and cryptic notes. As he flipped through the pages, one word stood out: revenge. The journal spoke of dark rituals, of summoning spirits and binding them to the living. Mark's mother had been involved in something far darker than he had ever imagined. She had made a pact with something beyond this world. Something that now controlled her in death. The final entry sent chills down his spine. I did it for you, Mark. They promised me I'd never lose you. But now, I'm lost, and they are coming for you too. Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to breathe, almost shifting on their own as he moved through the house. His mother's journal lay open on the kitchen table, its cryptic symbols and notes scattered before him like a puzzle he didn't want to solve. The whispering started again, just a faint murmur from the walls, like a distant conversation in another room. Mark sat upright in bed, listening. The whisper grew louder, distinct now, a voice, but it was warped, cracked like old wood splitting under pressure. He couldn't make out the words, but it sent chills down his spine. Mark got out of bed, slowly pushing the door open. The hallway stretched out before him, dark and suffocating. The whispers grew louder, coming from the direction of his mother's room. His hand shook as he reached for the doorknob. For a moment, he hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. But the whispering persisted, almost pleading now. He had to know. The door creaked open. And the cold hit him like a wave. His mother's room was bathed in darkness, the faint outline of the bed just visible in the gloom. The shadows around the edges of the room seemed to pulse, like something was breathing in the walls. Then, the whisper stopped. Mark's eyes scanned the room. It was empty, or at least, it appeared to be. But then, a soft movement caught his attention. In the corner, barely illuminated by the dim light from the hall, a figure stood. It was her. His mother stood at the far side of the room, facing the wall. Her body was stiff, motionless, her nightgown hanging loosely off her gaunt frame. Mark's heart raced, every instinct in his body telling him to run. To get away from whatever was standing there. "Mom." His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. Slowly, she turned, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. Mark took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward him, her mouth opening as if she were trying to speak, but the sound that came out wasn't human. A guttural, broken wail filled the room, echoing off the walls. It was a sound of pain, of suffering beyond anything's face contorted into a grotesque mask of agony, her body trembling as if something were pulling at her from within. Mark stumbled back, his legs giving way beneath him as he hit the floor. The figure advanced, her eyes locked on his, that horrific wail growing louder, more desperate. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. The figure vanished. The room was silent again. Mark lay on the floor, panting, his heart racing. He couldn't move, couldn't think. The only thing running through his mind was that it wasn't over. Whatever had taken his mother wasn't done with him yet. Over the next few days, the hauntings intensified. The house grew colder, the air thick with a sense of dread that seemed to cling to Mark wherever he went. Objects would move on their own, furniture shifting slightly when he wasn't looking, doors opening and closing with no explanation. The whispers never stopped, growing louder at night, echoing through the empty halls. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, his mother's ghostly figure, standing at the foot of his bed, her hollow eyes watching him. The dreams were worse. In them, his mother wasn't just a ghost. She was something else, something twisted and malevolent, her face contorted into a snarl, her fingers clawing at his skin as she dragged him into the darkness. Mark spent his days combing through the journal, searching for answers, but the more he read, the more he realized just how deep his mother's involvement in the occult had been. She had dabbled in dark magic, rituals that went beyond the realm of the natural world. The last few entries in the journal were frantic, her handwriting shaky as she described her growing fear of something that had begun to haunt her dreams. "It's coming for me. I can feel it. The ritual went wrong, and now I can't stop it. They promised me everything, but I'm inside the house now. It's watching me. I hear it at night. I see it in the corners of the room, waiting. They want you, Mark. They want you too." Mark felt sick as he read the final entry, the ink smudged as if her hand had trembled as she wrote it. She had made a pact, a deal with something dark and ancient, all to protect him. And now, whatever it was coming for him too. That night, as Mark lay in bed, the air grew colder than ever before. Frost began to form on the windows, spreading like veins across the glass. The whispers were back, louder this time, almost as if they were inside his head. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. His breath turned to mist in the air as the shadows in the room seemed to thicken. Mark sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. The door to his bedroom slowly creaked open, a figure stood in the doorway, shrouded in darkness. It wasn't his mother this time. This was something else. Something much worse. It stepped into the room, its movements unnatural, its limbs too long, its body twisted in ways that defied nature. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Mark could feel its eyes on him, watching, waiting. He couldn't move. He couldn't scream. His body was frozen in place as the figure crept closer, the air around it growing colder with each step. The whispers grew louder, filling his head until they were deafening. Then, it spoke. Its voice was a low, rasping growl. Filled with malice and hatred, "She called me to save you, but now I have come to take you." Mark's heart stopped. The figure lunged at him, its cold fingers wrapping around his throat. Mark woke up on the floor of his room. He couldn't stay there any longer. He needed answers, and he needed to get out before whatever had come for his mother took him too. Desperate, he packed a bag and headed for the only place he thought might have answers, an old family friend who had once been close to his mother. Mrs. Darrow lived on the outskirts of town, a reclusive woman who had always been interested in the occult, much like his mother had been. When he arrived at her house, Mrs. Darrow greeted him with a knowing look. She didn't seem surprised to see him, as if she had been expecting this visit. "She told me this day would come," Mrs. Darrow said as she poured tea, her hands shaking slightly. "Your mother. She was involved in things no one should be." Mark nodded, his throat dry. "I know. I've seen things. Something is in the house. Something evil." Mrs. Darrow's face darkened. "It's not just in the house, Mark. It's in you. Your mother made a deal with something very old, something very dangerous. She thought she could protect you, but all she did was bind it to your bloodline." Mark felt a wave of nausea. "What do you mean?" "She tried to save you from a sickness, but in doing so, she gave herself, and you, to it. The entity doesn't just want her. It wants you. And it will stop at nothing to claim you." Mark's heart raced. "How do I stop it?" Mrs. Darrow hesitated, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You can't stop it. But you can banish it, temporarily. There's a ritual. It's dangerous, but it might give you enough time to escape. You have to break the bond your mother made." She handed him a piece of paper, the instructions for the ritual scrawled in hurried handwriting. "But be warned, Mark. The entity will fight back. It won't let you go easily." Mark nodded, his hands trembling as he took the paper. He didn't have a choice. If he didn't try, the entity would take him. Just left Mrs. Darrow's house with a heavy heart. The piece of paper she gave him was clutched tightly in his hand, his mind racing. The ritual, his only hope to escape whatever had taken hold of his mother, felt like a distant, impossible task. But he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He had seen too much. The thing in his house wasn't just haunting him. It was waiting, watching, closing in. He returned to the house at dusk. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. Mark stood at the front door, staring at the house as dread settled over him like a heavy blanket. It looked the same as it always had, but he knew better now. There was something dark inside, something waiting for him to make a move. Taking a deep breath, Mark stepped inside. The house was colder than it had ever been, the chill seeping into his bones. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the silence was deafening. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet echoed like a warning, urging him to leave while he still could, but Mark didn't leave. Instead, he made his way to the living room, where he cleared a space in the center of the floor. He spread out the items Mrs. Darrow had instructed him to gather: candles, salt, a knife, and a small mirror that belonged to his mother. The mirror was old, its surface tarnished and cracked. But it would be essential to the ritual. With shaky hands, Mark lit the candles, their small flames flickering in the cold air. He drew a circle of salt around himself, just as Mrs. Darrow had instructed. The room felt darker now, the shadows pressing in on him from all sides. The ritual began with an incantation, whispered in a language Mark didn't understand. The words felt foreign on his tongue, as if they didn't belong in the world of the living. As he spoke, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and the whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each as he continued the incantation, his voice trembling. The whispers became more insistent, filling his head until he could barely hear his own thoughts. They were coming from all directions now, echoing off the walls, as if the very house was alive with the voices of the dead. Then, the floorboards beneath him began to creak. Slowly at first, but then more violently, as if something was moving beneath the house. Mark's hands trembled, but he kept chanting, the knife gripped tightly in his hand. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twist and writhe. Suddenly, the candles flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. The only light came from the faint glow of the mirror in front of him, its surface reflecting the faintest glimmer of moonlight. But there was something else in the mirror now, something moving just behind him, his mother. She stood just beyond the circle of salt, her figure bathed in shadows. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and empty, but there was something different about her this time. Her lips were twisted into a cruel smile, and her eyes gleamed with malice. "Mark," she whispered, her voice like nails on glass. "You can't escape me." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the knife tighter. "You're not my mother," he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down his spine. "Your mother is gone. She belongs to me now. And soon, so will you." Mark's breath hitched as the figure stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. The air around him grew colder, the room filled with the stench of rot and decay. He could feel the presence of something dark, something ancient, closing in on him. He raised the knife, his hand shaking. The ritual wasn't finished. Before he could utter another word, the figure lunged at him, her cold hands reaching for his throat. Mark stumbled back, his hand trembling as he tried to maintain control. The air felt dense, crushing him under an invisible force as the specter, his mother's twisted, decayed form, advanced toward him. Her fingers grazed the edge of the salt circle, and a hiss escaped her lips, recoiling as if burned. But the salt circle wouldn't protect him forever. Mark knew what he had to do. He grabbed the mirror from the floor and held it up, the tarnished surface now reflecting the horror that had taken over his mother. The creature's face twisted with rage as it saw its own reflection. The mirror seeming to ripple with the force of the entity's hate. "You think this can stop me?" It snarled, its voice a guttural growl. "You are already mine." Mark felt the pressure mounting. His ears rang, and the whispers were deafening now, as if they were drilling into his brain. He kept his eyes on the mirror, chanting the final words of the ritual, his voice trembling but steady. The air around him began to shift, a cold wind swirling through the room as the candles reignited in a burst of flame. The shadows writhed and twisted, but something was changing. The entity seemed to hesitate, its form flickering as if it were struggling to maintain control. Mark could see his mother's face, her real face, beneath the horror. Her eyes pleading with him. She was still in there, trapped, consumed by whatever dark force had taken hold of her. "Mom," Mark whispered, tears stinging his eyes. "I'm so sorry." But there was no time for sorrow. The creature lunged again, its mouth twisted into a snarl, but this time, Mark was ready. He held the mirror up, chanting the final incantation as loudly as he could, his voice cutting through the whispers. the creature let out a piercing scream, its body convulsing as the mirror began warped, twisting into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. The air crackled with energy as the house itself seemed to shake, the walls groaning under the strain of the ritual. Mark pressed the mirror closer, his hands shaking. The entity shrieked again, its body writhing as it struggled to break free, but the salt circle held, keeping it at bay. Mark could feel the force of the thing pushing against him, trying to break his concentration, but he held on, repeating the incantation over and over again. The creature's form began to disintegrate, its body dissolving into shadows, its screams echoing through the house like the wail of a banshee. Mark kept chanting, his voice hoarse, his body trembling with exhaustion, until finally, the entity was gone. The house fell silent. Mark collapsed to the floor, his chest heaving as he gasped for breath. The mirror lay shattered beside him, its surface cracked and broken. The air was still, the oppressive weight that had hung over the house lifted, but Mark knew it wasn't over. Mark didn't leave the house after the ritual. He couldn't. Something in him had changed, as if a part of him had been left behind in that circle of salt, in that struggle with the thing that had taken his mother. The house was quiet now, almost peaceful, but it was a false peace. He could still feel the presence of the entity lurking in the corners of his mind, watching him, waiting for its chance to return. The whispers were gone, but the silence was worse. It was a silence filled with anticipation, with the promise of something darker to come. Mark spent his days pacing the house, his mind racing. He had banished the entity, but he hadn't destroyed it. He knew it would come back. It always did. The nights were the worst. The shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and shifting just beyond the edge of his vision. He could feel them watching him, waiting for him to let his guard down. The creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows sent a shiver down his spine. Then, one night, it returned. Mark woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. He lay still, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, coming closer with each passing moment. He knew it was her. The door to his bedroom creaked open, and the air grew cold. Mark didn't move. He couldn't. He lay frozen in place, his breath shallow as the figure stepped into the room. It was his mother again, but this time, there was no mistaking the darkness in her eyes. The entity had returned, and it had brought her with it. She stood at the foot of his bed, her hollow eyes staring down at him. Her mouth twisted into a cruel smile, and the whispers began again, soft and insistent. "You thought you could stop me," the voice said, low and menacing. "But you are mine now. You always were." Mark's heart raced, his body trembling with fear. He knew there was no escape this time. The ritual had only delayed the inevitable.